Welcome to Single Parenting with Connection, Not Perfection, the podcast that honors your messy reality. It's the support you crave without the usual emotional landmines. I'm your host, Dr. Gila, and I promise I will never tell you to just tag your partner in. Before we start, quick reminder. While I am a licensed psychologist and a certified coach, this podcast is not coaching and it's not therapy, and it's not a replacement for medical or psychological advice. It is for educational and informational purposes only. All right, let's dive in. Hi there. Welcome to episode 2. As we're starting this podcast series, I thought that I would start with one of the most foundational topics and concepts and frameworks that I have that I know has been helpful in my own family and has helped so many of my clients. You know, in my experience, two of the most common things that families struggle with, some of the most common questions that I get and reasons people reach out for coaching fall into two sort of categories. One is I cannot stop snapping. No matter how hard I try, I just keep losing it. With my kids, I want to do better. I don't like this. Please help me. And then the other is my kid has these big explosive meltdowns or they're having tantrums all the time. They are losing it and I don't know how to handle it. And I don't know how to help them build the skills to not have this happen so often. And both of those are, of course, the same general topic, which is emotion regulation. And I know that you have probably heard this term at this point because it is such a sort of buzzword in parenting and really in lifing because it's not just important for parenting. But I'm going to share with you today the way that I like to think of emotion regulation. I have a visual framework that I use that is simple enough that people find it really helpful, not just for themselves, but also for their kids. So, in my opinion, the way I like to see it, we each have a metaphorical sink inside us. And when that sink is really full, just a few more drops of water are going to make it overflow. And that overflow state is called dysregulation. So, this is where you might snap and yell and say things that you regret, or your kid might snap and yell, they might kick, they might throw things, or you might shut down, or they might shut down. That's another way that it can look, right? This is when we talk about like the fight, flight, or freeze, this is the dysregulation response. When your sink is emptier, the exact same drops that made it overflow in that first scenario, you have room for them without your sink overflowing, and you can even handle more. So, the key for emotion regulation is how do we keep our sinks from getting to that really full or overflowing place? And I want to say, nobody is going to do this 100% of the time. I certainly don't, right? We all lose it sometimes. You are going to have an overflowing sink sometimes. And one of the things I really like to remind people, you're probably going to hear me say it again and again on this podcast, is perfection is not the goal ever. So there's two reasons for that. One, it's just not possible. You are human, you are a parent, you are probably a single parent, you are carrying more than you probably can carry in a world that isn't set up to support what you are carrying, right? And so it makes sense that your sink sometimes is going to overflow. The other piece is that it's also modeling for our kids. So our kids' sinks are overflowing sometimes. They're going to overflow. That is normal. That is expected. That is understandable. And for them to know and to see that our sinks overflow too sometimes is, first of all, validating. It sends that message that this is what it is to be human. It's part of what it is to be human, is that sometimes our sinks overflow. It also gives us an opportunity to model for them, what do you do after the overflow and during the overflow, which I know you might not feel super confident in right now, and that's okay, right? This is a big piece of what I do work on with parents is, what do you do when you feel like your sink is overflowing? What do you do after that overflow to clean up the mess, as it were? So I just wanted to say that right from the gate, from the get-go, is your sink is going to overflow sometimes, and that's not because you're a bad person or a bad parent or you're failing or broken. It's because you're human. Having said that, there are thankfully a lot of things that we can do to reduce how often our sinks get really full or overflow. So, when your sink is already overflowing, in order to keep yourself from expressing that overflow in damaging, destructive, hurtful ways, that process really requires self control, right? And self control is much harder than self regulation. So it is so much easier. It is not easy, but it is easier to intervene when your sink levels are lower than when they are already full or even more so overflowing. So the more we can work on the emotion regulation piece earlier on, the less we need to use that self-control when our sink is overflowing. The good news is that there are things that we can do to build our sort of sink health, sink hygiene, so that when water comes in, because let me tell you, water is always going to be coming in. I don't think anyone ever has a completely empty sink, and that faucet is pretty much never not at least dripping. So water's going to come in. So we need some processes, some systems, some skills to keep our sinks healthy so that water has someplace to go and it's not constantly getting full or in a constant state of fullness. There are a few things that I want to point out about what this framework brings up and some of the things, the reasons why I like the framework and why my clients do too. So first of all, I want to highlight the fact that the same drops of water make the sink overflow in one scenario and don't make it overflow in another scenario. And I think this is very common, but it's something that we tend to forget, right? So this is why, for example, one day a wet towel on the floor is going to annoy you, but you're just going to pick it up and say something to your kid maybe, but not snap and yell at them. Another day, you might see that same wet towel on the floor and completely lose it. I think we've all been there, right? Why is this always on the floor? How many times have I told you I can't be the only one to take care of this house, right? All the things. So the same stressor, the same drop of water is going to have a different effect at different times. And that's true for our kids also, which is also, I think, really hard to hold on to, right? It can be frustrating when you see your child really struggling or losing it in a scenario where you feel like, well, yesterday you were totally fine when we went to the grocery store. You usually love going to the grocery store. How come now you can't handle going to the grocery store, right? It's really frustrating. And development in general happens in a non-linear fashion. And this is even more true, or it can be even more true for anyone who is neurodivergent. So in development, we see that there are varying capacities. And in emotion regulation and self-regulation, which is certainly a skill, just like other things, just like reading and math, this is a skill that we need to learn. And to be honest, it's a skill that is always a work in progress. It is something that you can't just kind of check off your list. Okay, I achieved emotion regulation. I am done. I wish it was that easy. But it's always a work in progress. And so, this is something that is going to fluctuate on different days. And it's helpful, I think, to keep that in mind, both in terms of what we expect from ourselves and in terms of what we expect from our kids. I also want to point out that, often when we think of dysregulation, when we picture our kid having an explosive meltdown or us yelling and snapping, the emotion that comes to mind is usually anger. But it's not just anger that can fill our sinks. In fact, this visual analogy came to me the first time when my kid he was a toddler And we had been at this music class that he loves. And after the class, he was running around and playing with this other kid. And there was just something about the quality of their play, the energy of their play, that I was feeling increasingly uncomfortable about, nervous about. It felt, and I just got this visual in my head like, oh, I feel like there's an overflowing sink and I can't turn it off. And that energy, that sort of out of control energy, it wasn't because he was angry. He was excited, right? He was probably a bunch of other things. And so it's not just about anger. And the other thing is that usually we have more than one emotion at a time. It's not just about any one emotion. So that brings me to another point that I want to make, which is that, you might have heard this, the adage that you should name your feelings. And I think that it is absolutely valuable to teach our children how to recognize and name and express different feelings. But in the moment when your sink is really full or overflowing, often that is not only hard for our children and for us sometimes, but sometimes it can backfire. It can be counterproductive. So if you have tried to say to your child when they're in a meltdown, I know you're so angry, and they have, yelled at you even more and shut down even more. First of all, just because they get more agitated doesn't necessarily mean that was the wrong thing to say. But what I will say is that for some kids, they don't want you to tell them how they're feeling, right? Don't tell me how I'm feeling. They might also feel some shame about that, right? They might feel shame about their shame or about their anger. And neurodivergent kids, especially, can be really sensitive to shame. Also, one feeling might not actually accurately capture it, right? So they might say, no, that's not how I'm feeling. And that might be true. It might be part of it, and it might not be all of it. And then the other thing is that in that moment, trying to work on that skill, because that is a skill also, right? The skill of recognizing and naming and articulating and expressing what you're feeling is a skill. And it's one that does require some cognitive processing, some thinking. And in that moment when your child's sink is really full or overflowing, they might not be capable of that. One of the things I like about this sink model is that we can shift the language to simply making an observation about their sink. So something like, oh boy, your sink is really full right now, isn't it? Right? Something like that. Or it seems like your sink is really full. Now, again, this might trigger your child also, but I think it's less likely to. And part of why is because it sort of captures the big picture essence of what's going on without getting stuck in the weeds of trying to name what exactly they're feeling. It also externalizes it a little. So you may have heard of the strategy of personification of anxiety, for example. So this is when you come up with like a character, and your anxiety is this character, this person or this creature, and you give it a name. And that can be really helpful for a variety of reasons, including that it sort of highlights that your anxiety, or in this case, your sink, is a part of who you are, but it doesn't define who you are. And it also separates a little bit from that shame piece, right? You're not having a meltdown because you're a bad kid or because you are defiant or any of these like other critical words. You are having a meltdown because your sink is overflowing. And especially when, as a family, you have language around that and you communicate to them when your sink is getting full or when your sink is overflowing, it normalizes this, right? Oh, well, this is just my sink overflowing. Yeah, that makes sense, right? It's not about me losing it. It's about my sink overflowing. I have influence over my sink. There are things I can do about it, but it's not me as a person, right? And it also sort of inherently validates why they are having a hard time, because when your sink is overflowing, it is hard to stay calm, certainly. And it is hard for them to not, whatever it is they're doing, kick, scream, whatever it is. Now, I know some of you might be saying, well, I don't want to like excuse and normalize that behavior. And I hear you. What we are validating and normalizing is where the behavior is coming from, what they are experiencing internally. And we can work on shifting how they express that, right? But right now we're validating where it's coming from. And in doing that, it can sort of take away a little bit of the edge off of that shame piece. The fourth thing that I want to mention, I did just allude to it, is that it gives you a language that you can use together, not just in the moment when someone's sink is overflowing, but even more importantly, in advance so that you can start to work on building proactive awareness and skills. Because again, the goal, the holy grail, the thing that we really want is to learn how to intervene sooner, right? To learn to recognize when our sinks are starting to get full before they actually reach that full or overflowing state. And the good news, point number 5, the good news is that there are multiple points where we can work on skill building and intervention. So, using the sink analogy, we have the pipe, right? The pipe can get clogged. The drain can be closed or can have a big old hairball in it. And that keeps it from being able to ever get empty. If you think about it, my hair, I always end up with like a clump of hair in the shower drain. And if you had a sink with a clump of hair like that, then you could do all the beautiful deep breathing that you want to. Your sink is probably still going to get full quickly and often. It is fighting an uphill battle. Yes, deep breathing, still amazing. All of those skills, still helpful and great. But if we don't address that clog in the drain, then it's going to make your life so much harder. And you're just going to feel like a failure that you're constantly having an overflowing sink or a really full sink. And so if we can figure out what that hair, that clog is, then that's helpful. And then also practices in day-to-day life that keep the drain open, right? Because we want the drain to be open so that, again, water is always going to come in. We want somewhere for that water to be able to go. We can also take a bucket to the sink and empty a big old bucket full at a time if we need to. And then the other point of intervention is the faucet. We can't control all of what's coming into our sinks, right? There are things that are outside of our control, but there are some things that we do have control over and that we can at least turn down that water coming into the sink, if not totally turn it off. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we can also learn skills about what to do when your sink is overflowing and afterwards. How do you clean it up? How do you repair and reconnect afterwards? And that all leads me to the final point that I want to make, which is that one of the things that can fill your sink really quickly is somebody else's sink overflowing into it. And that's what happens when our kids are having a really hard time. They're having a meltdown, they're having a tantrum, they're shut down. If our sinks don't have space to take on some of that overflow, then our sinks overflow into their sink and vice versa. And before you know it, you have a huge puddle on the floor. So it's very important for so many reasons for us to work on our own sink hygiene, as I call it, to take care of our own sinks, to learn how to recognize when our sinks are getting full and how to intervene in one of these many places where you can intervene. So I hope you found that helpful. I often hear that people say, I'm never going to look at a sink the same way again. And here's my invitation for you of what to take from this. So first of all, if you like this analogy, one thing that I think could be really beautiful and helpful to model for your kids is for you to acknowledge, so you can explain to them the sink analogy. And one of these days I'm going to write a children's book, but I haven't yet. So, um, but you can explain the analogy to them, and then you can use that language. For example, when you find that you have maybe just said something that you regretted, or you find yourself feeling really stressed, you can pause and take that moment and say, whew, my sink is really full right now. And you can even maybe say something like, I know that you really want to listen to this song right now. My sink feels really full, and I don't think that I can handle listening to that song. So let's wait until my sink is a little emptier, right? So you can model recognizing and talking about your own sink. And then when you think they're ready, you can also bring it up around noticing their sink, right? So you can say things like, hmm, I notice, or I think it seems like your sink is getting a little full. Does it feel like your sink is full, right? You can either ask them or make the observation. You can also use it in advance. So, one way that I like to use it is, I've noticed that when we go to the park and then also go out to eat, your sink tends to get really full. So, what do you think would help keep your sink from getting really full? I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear what your ideas are too. And again, that conversation is going to vary depending on how old your child is, but these are just some ideas. The other thing is that people ask me, like, how can I do this, right? Okay, I love the sink model. What do I do with it? I need to be able to regulate myself better. The very first step, it doesn't sound sexy or exciting, but the very first step is to build your awareness. I like to call it the awareness muscle because it is like a muscle. This is a skill. It takes practice, it takes strengthening. And so, building into your day checkpoints where you begin to build awareness about recognizing the signs and symptoms and like flags of when your sink is emptier and when your sink is getting full. So I recommend choosing an activity that you do every day already and tying this in, tagging it in with that activity. So, like I said, a lot of people often say they never look at a sink the same way again. So, let's use that, right? Maybe every time you're washing your hands during the day, you take a moment, and I don't mean a 5-minute meditation, I mean literally a moment. Maybe put your hand on your chest and check in. How's my sink doing? If you want to take a nice big belly breath, beautiful. But the main thing here is to build that awareness because the more you practice that outside the moment, the more automated it becomes and the more easily you can access that when your sink is starting to get full and when you're in those harder moments. So that is my invitation for you for this episode. And my other invitation is that, this is, of course, a huge topic. There's so much more to talk about. And it's also something that varies from individual to individual. It's very personalized about what fills your sink, what are the signs that your sink is getting full, and what are the things that help you lower those sink levels when your sink is starting to get full. This can be a very individualized and personalized thing. And if you're ever looking for a little bit of support in figuring out what this looks like for you or for your kiddos or both, please reach out. Right now, at the time of the recording, I am offering free consult calls. I'm not sure how long that'll last, but right now I'm offering free consult calls. I'll put the link in the show notes, and you can always reach out to me at hello@drgilaparenting.com. Next episode, I have a treat for you. It is a replay of an interview that I did with Amanda Diekman, and it is about parent burnout. And I thought that this would be a good segue from today's episode because one of the things that I hear so often is I can't work on my sink because it's just in this constant state of overflow, constant state of being full. I am just at my limits. And I hear you and I get that. And Amanda has a beautiful way of talking about burnout. She has a really beautiful analogy that she uses for that. I'm a big fan of visuals. This was an interview that I did as part of a summit that I hosted last February, but I wanted to replay it for you because it was just so beautiful. And I heard from so many people that it was really helpful and supportive. So tune in to that, and I will see you there.